All right. Hello, everybody. I'm here with PhilosophiCat, who I've seen around YouTube for some years. She's made content relating to perennialism, traditionalism, some videos on Julius Evola. I guess she's known as kind of the Evola girl in these spheres. And yeah, I'm excited to ask her some questions, just general questions about her worldview. As many of you guys know, I'm interested in perennialism, Platonism myself, so I'm always interested to hear how people got into that way of thinking. So if you could just kind of give us a bit about your background, how did you get into these ideas, what's your story getting into all this?
Well, interestingly, your channel was one of the first I found when I started getting interested in this. I think some years ago you made a series on like the metaphysics of perennialism or something by that name.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so that was one of the first things I actually came across. But I had kind of the typical journey of, I was raised in a very strict Catholic family, went through the obligatory angry atheist phase, and from there started to kind of rediscover a more non-dogmatic spirituality. And, the rest, as they say, is history. One thing led to another. I ended up reading Julius Evola's Doctrine of Awakening, which, was a very important book for me in terms of, it was a really helpful thing to read, trying to find my way back to spirituality from an atheist position, because Buddhism was not asking me to believe in anything. It was just, here's the process. This is the path. Walk it for yourself and see what you think. And I wasn't having to try to learn about this God or that God or memorize scriptures or anything like that. So that was that book was a real turning point for me, and I owe a debt to Evola on that account. And of course, from there, I started reading some of his other books that were a little bit less challenging than Doctrine of Awakening, which was probably not the best one to start with, but I got through it.
Yeah, great. And you've shared a lot of what you've found on your channel, which we all appreciate. So you get into Evola, and from there, are there particular other authors that you've become interested in? Would you say there's like a group of thinkers that you identify with? Would you call yourself a traditionalist? How would you kind of categorize yourself now, currently?
I hate putting labels on myself, because anytime you do that, you have to accept the whole ball of wax, right? And, I don't like to lump myself in with anything, because I feel like the label it's a bit limiting. For the same reason, I'm not eager to adopt some kind of specific religion. I also don't want to adopt a specific philosophical label, because I do kind of feel like once you adopt that and you're taking that as a whole with all of the assumptions and beliefs and ideas that come with it, you're kind of boxing yourself in, where it's like, oh, well, I don't want to explore that thought because it's outside of my label, right? So I do like the traditionalists a lot. Maybe I would call myself one. I don't know. Obviously Evola has been a favorite of mine. I have read some Guinan and stuff. He doesn't grab me the same way that Evola does, but I do like his stuff. And I do have a background from university in like political philosophy and things like that as well. So, that they don't exactly teach traditionalism in university though, so that's all been self-taught since.
Okay. So if you could just kind of break down for us, like, what does traditionalism mean, broadly speaking? Maybe we could kind of tackle it in terms of those conventional philosophical categories. So metaphysics, epistemology, ontology, ethics, those sorts of questions. So like, what do you glean from that tradition about the ultimate nature of being? Like, is there a highest principle that you identify with? Is that principle personal? Would you call that God? What would you call those higher principles in general? Is there a plurality? Are we going for a more like pagan polytheism with your kind of nondescript traditionalism? And then beneath that level, how does that connect back to ethics and to practice? Just kind of briefly, just an overview of your platform, your position in general.
That's a lot there to unpack. Wow. Um, some of these are a little bit tricky for me to answer because I am really reluctant to come to a firm position or belief on some of these things because I feel like if I don't have a way to really know, once again, I'm reluctant to kind of pin something down and then cling to it very rigidly. And all of this is still very much a work in progress, and there's still a journey that's happening, and I imagine will continue for the duration of my life. Um, so I don't have like very strong, solidified beliefs about this is what God is and this is what's true. Um, I have my own experiences that have resonated with me as being true. And, maybe some spiritual intuition comes into that as well. I do read things, and it's often a case of like, okay, what this person is writing, that seems in line with what I have kind of felt in my heart and soul to be true, or this kind of is rubbing me the wrong way and there's something not quite right about this argument. Um, so it's probably, it's a very maybe irrational approach. Maybe a bit feminine in some ways and very, very scattered. But I mean, in terms of like, I guess we can kind of start with God, right? Because where else do you start? Um, at the beginning. So, how one defines God is it's often either just relying on the words of prophets and sages in spiritual texts, or you're trying to have your own experience of knowing God and then developing your ideas that way. And as I said, like that latter is more the path that I'm on. So I don't know if I'll ever reach the answers to these questions. It's kind of still unfolding for me, but I do tend to lean towards the Vedic idea of there being this like kind of unconditioned, unconscious Godhead, Brahman, and then a personified God that's manifested from that Brahma. Um, and I have wondered if maybe God is going through a process like we are, but on a far greater and grander scale. And the unfolding universe is, his own expression of coming to know himself and becoming more self-aware. And maybe there's this aspect of God that's dormant and unaware, and then another aspect that is aware and part of creation. But the question that I have in my mind in that regard is, that maybe seems to conflict with the idea that God is eternal and unchanging. When you look, though, at the Trimurti, you have Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the upholder, Shiva, the destroyer. Well, how is that eternal and unchanging? So it's almost like maybe at least part of God has to be conditioned in order to interact with conditioned existence. And perhaps there's another part of God that is eternal and unchanging. But these are just some of the questions that kind of float around in my mind and sort of like where I'm sort of headed with that. What do you think?
Yeah, that's perfectly sensible. I find that distinction between the eternal, ineffable, exempt, transcendent part of God and then the involved energies of God, the actions of God, that process is important. It comes up in Orthodoxy. I've seen Catholics try to make sense of that in light of divine simplicity. But these problems just permeate any theological tradition, whether it's pagan or Christian or whatnot. So you're aware of the problems, and I mean, ultimately, we don't know God. So admitting
And
that
can
you
we
don't,
ever?
yeah, right. Well, that could be a point of contention depending on where you stand on some of these mystical practices, and how you ground that concept for yourself or that experience of God. So in that vein, since you have a kind of personal, intuitive, experiential view of spirituality, what does that pursuit of God look like for you in daily practice? What do you do that connects you with that principle?
Yeah, that's something I've struggled with a lot because since I'm not pinned down to a specific religious tradition, I'm not really adopting the practices of one or another, and I'm reluctant to mix and match traditions in that regard. So at the moment, for me, I'm just mainly just trying to kind of constantly keep mindful of God and a divine presence, and try to stay on, a higher vibe in the course of my daily life, make sure that I'm living in line with my principles, living with integrity. And, that's not probably very traditionalist. So this is one of the reasons why maybe I wouldn't call myself a traditionalist, because to some extent you have to have a practice, and feeling like I don't know what the right practice is results in something of a paralysis in me, where I'm like, well, if I don't know what the right one is, I shouldn't choose until I'm sure. This is why I also don't tell people who follow my channel what path they should take. I say, you have to discover that for yourself. Maybe that path is different for everybody. But in terms of discovering the right one for me, I've found things that, I kind of like, but there's stuff that I don't necessarily agree with or whatever. For example, as much as I like the Vedic tradition, there are parts of it that I just don't necessarily agree with following. Like, I don't agree with the dietary principles of that tradition. And so that would, if I were seeking initiation, would automatically exclude me. So it's just stuff like that, right? But, I try to, do meditation or yoga or whatever, and just generally try to practice a loving compassion and live with right action.
Right, which I guess is excusable for you. You are American, right?
Yeah, I was born in America.
I would say it's excusable for Americans in particular, because we're less grounded in tradition. Like, many of us grew up with Christianity, but in another sense, we're kind of our own civilization coming into being, yet to define our spirituality. Even though we have kind of common English origins, there are divisions within there in terms of spiritual traditions, different varieties of Protestantism. You have like the Anglican, Presbyterian, Puritan, which each of which have different values, different emphasis on the nature of free will, different concepts of these spiritual ideas, different practices. So we're still kind of figuring things out. And also, I'd say our civilization is at a turning point where we have to reformulate some things from a very deep level. So I will, forgive this kind of lack of distinctions and, experimenting with what works, because that's, what else ultimately can you do in a position like ours? So do you think that your experience with spirituality is reflective of other people that you've met your age, your peers? Do you see your journey as part of a broader social trend? Do you see any pattern there?
Possibly. If there is a trend, I don't know how far ahead of that trend I might be, but there, when society reaches like peak cynicism, which is kind of part of this atheistic and nihilistic phase that we're sort of going through as a culture, at some point that's going to run its course and the pendulum is going to swing back the other way. And so it's possible that my own personal journey is like this microcosm overall trend. Just like I went through this atheist phase as an individual, maybe society is going through their own atheist phase on like this bigger scale and longer time frame. Because it's not sustainable for society to stay on this course. The question is, when it swings back to spirituality, what is that going to look like? Is it going to be authentic? What tradition might they latch on to, if any? As much as I dislike Christianity for my own reasons, which, not to be offensive to any Christians in the chat, because I don't dislike Christians, it's just not a path for me. But I'd rather almost see society go back to that than go towards something like this, this kind of new age hippie spirituality, which is, I find very destructive and anti-traditional.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that you have a desire for more communal practice? That's a big part of religion for most people. For my part, I've always practiced Christianity. I'm a perennialist. Metaphysically, you could call me a heretic in terms of Catholic dogma, but I go to Mass. I celebrate the Mass, and that's a communal practice that I get a lot of fulfillment out of. So do you feel that need? Have you sought out similar practices?
I before COVID, I was going with a couple of like-minded friends to the Hare Krishna temple, which, the Hare Krishnas have their own problems, but that's what was available. They had some very nice kirtans and things like that, which I enjoyed going to. And I really missed that a lot when the lockdown started. And now I'm living in a place that doesn't have anything like that. So it is something I would like, but it's not very conducive to where I am right now, unfortunately. But I do think that is a really important thing to have, good association on your spiritual path, whatever that might be. And it's difficult to do it in a vacuum, For all that Evola talked about self-initiation, he had a group of people around him who were doing the same thing, at least.
Right. Yeah. I think any spiritual innovator can't operate from a vacuum, like even the stories of the Buddha. He learns from the sannyasis that are already out there practicing their forms of asceticism. So you have to find some grounding in a tradition. I'm just curious, have you looked into Platonism at all?
I have looked into it. It is something I'd like to be more well versed in, because what I do know of it I have found very attractive and compelling. I don't know that I'd agree with everything, but there's a lot there that I do agree with. And obviously, as a practitioner of Hellenistic astrology, that's very grounded in these kind of older Greek traditions and ways of thinking. So that is, even just for my own professional reasons, I'd like to learn more about it, but I think it would be philosophically and spiritually very enriching.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I like about Platonism is you get this idea of the metaphysical ultimate and its emanations and this kind of whole scheme that's very appealing in traditionalism, perennialism, because, something resonates as true about it. To me, I also have, rational arguments and stuff like that for my own sake. But what I like about Platonism specifically is this idea that the first principle is not only the principle of unity, but also the principle of goodness. And that kind of ties in ethical content into the metaphysics, clarifies to a certain degree what we mean by goodness in common sense parlance. Like, if goodness is in some way the same as oneness at the highest level, then we can see, in health, the good of the body is its integration, maintaining itself as one. So
physiognomy is real.
Well, yeah, that too. Plato also recognized that. So do you have a similar kind of wedding in your own view between that first principle of things and the first principle ethically? And could you, if you had one kind of cardinal value that you put before others, what would that be? And is it tied to that kind of highest metaphysical first principle?
Yeah, I would say kind of, I do have that sort of unity of those concepts in my mind, which, despite my lack of a specific traditional spiritual practice, I always try to keep in my mind, rightness of action and integrity and goodness and virtue, because it is tied to that, right? That's, if nothing else, you can't get closer to God without those things, regardless of what your actual ritualized practice is. So I do agree with that. What was the second part of your question? Sorry.
Oh, just what that kind of cardinal virtue that you value the most would be. What does that look like in your dealings? Goodness is a little vague in a certain respect. So I care about what's good. It's yeah, but so does everybody else. Is there one value that for me, it's always been finding the truth. And I don't consider that necessarily to be a value in itself, because truth is a property about propositions and philosophical systems, and it's kind of for the sake of that ultimate reality that you're aiming at, right? But it's just always been my guiding telos, and what I see as my purpose in life is seeking out the truth. So do you have a similar kind of cardinal virtue guiding you?
Well, I was about to answer truth without any hesitation, but then I was like, well, maybe beauty would be a close second or tied to it. And then I was kind of like, well, are they really different? And in
Hmm.
some ways, I suppose beauty comes from truth. It's emblematic of truth. It's reflective of truth. So I guess, on balance, I would have to probably put truth in the highest slot.
Okay, and what does that look like for you? So let's tie it back to like epistemology now. So it's good that you've acknowledged what you don't know about spirituality and you're seeking out a wide variety of sources, trying to find what is true so that is consistent with this search for meaning and truth in life. But like a little more concretely, like what do you do on a day-to-day basis to try to get yourself a little closer to that end goal? Like for my part, obviously it's philosophical reading, study groups that I do with others, rumination, philosophical contemplation, kind of Neoplatonic lines of thinking, and spiritual practice, trying to like align my rational component with my irrational component and all of that. So I have a toolkit of practices that I use to try to keep me on track. Have you developed a similar toolkit for yourself?
It wasn't something I consciously developed. It's just something that to me just feels like very natural to have as my normal daily life. But I'm doing most of the same things you are. Like I'm always reading books. If I'm not reading about something related to these ideas, which is frankly pretty much all I read, except at Christmas time, then sometimes I let myself read fiction books, but that's the only time of the year that I do that. Because it's Christmas, right? I got to indulge my love of epic fantasy novels at some point. So yeah, I'm always reading stuff like that. Obviously, I do feel like what I do with astrology plays into that because I'm trying to use it as a tool to get at something approximating truth, and that takes up a lot of my time. And when I'm not doing that, I'm doing some kind of creative pursuit, whether it's like art or music or something like that. And then we're kind of getting into the beauty aspect of that and what kind of truth comes out through those activities. So, I mean, that's the bulk of my time right there.
When you practice music, are you thinking about these kind of spiritual concepts in the way that you create music? What kind of, is it ethically directed? Is it about self-expression? Something I was trained classically in music, and different time periods have different kind of values on and ideas on the place of music in society. Like during the Baroque, music was seen more as like an expression of God than an expression of ourselves. In the classical period, you start to deviate a little bit. Mozart is very idiosyncratic, and you can see a lot of personality coming through. And then with the Romantic, you kind of get an emphasis on universal human tides and feelings, sentiments, passions, but made very personal by individual composers. So, like, what do you see as the purpose of your music? How do you want to affect society with it? Is it a spiritual thing for you?
Um, well, I have to maybe break that up into two parts because there's just my standard singing practice that is something I do on my own solo. And then there is the music that I make with Uber Folk. So when I'm flying solo, um, that's, I wouldn't say that it's not spiritual, but it's not consciously so. I mean, I don't know if you found this with your music practice. Maybe an instrument's a bit different than a voice. I My background involves a lot of classical training. I was not ever trained to do like the Broadway belting. It's more like the old school operatic style. Um, and then I have kind of like a background in singing like in heavy metal bands, which is kind of like a little bit of a clash there. But so when I was back taking voice lessons several times a week, I was studying with a teacher she herself was a very spiritual woman, well, still is. And she had synesthesia, when your senses kind of cross. And the way that she would explain what I was supposed to be doing often, like, kind of had an almost spiritual undertone to it because of the way she was using her language. And I used to just love doing the warm-up drills. Like, most people would think that that's really boring, but I loved the way that she taught this. And it ended up being this really meditative sort of thing, because the way that she taught demanded a lot of focus and control and endurance. And there's something about hearing and feeling that note resonating inside of me, something about the vibration or whatever. So I often find that, if I'm seeking spiritual solace, just singing is as good or better than meditation for me sometimes. I don't, maybe it's just something about these particular sound vibrations or whatever, like some sound vibrations have divine properties. I don't know. But that's when I'm, on my own. With Uberfolk, there's a more conscious element to this because we're writing lyrics and we're writing it for a purpose. And, we are very much thinking about that. We want these songs to be high vibrational, inspirational songs, because when a person is listening to music and you tend to listen to the songs you like over and over, right? You're programming your mind with that. And so if people are going to listen to our songs over and over, we want them to be programming their minds with high vibe ideas. So a lot of the music we're doing now is directly tied into the Revolt series and taking ideas from Evola and Traditionalism. But even the album that we released prior to that, Music for Nations, still had a lot of those same ideas into it. George and I are both, fans of Evola, and he's very well read on that as well. So these come through in the lyrical themes, and we're trying to create a sound that can tie together the emotional element that music itself generates, with these high-minded ideals, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned kirtan earlier, and I had participated in a few of those in the Vedanta Center that I attended when I was still living in California. And something I've always liked about Hindustani music is that it's always for a particular occasion. They don't produce like abstract art pieces that are for their own sake. It's always like, this is for a feast after a wedding, or this is for this time of day. Classical music has some of that, nocturnes or whatnot, or for particular occasions. Do you notice any connection? Let's try to tie this back to, like, say, your astrology. Any connection between larger tides, say the movement of the planets or something like that, or even the movement of the seasons? It seems like you're sensitive to those sort of seasonal things. You only read fiction one time a year, apparently. So is there a similar seasonality to music? Do you write songs for particular occasions when you do it consciously? When you practice, do you find that you are called to a particular kind of music because of the time, because of your current state, that sort of thing?
With Uberfolk, George tends to be the main songwriter, although he increasingly allows me to contribute lyrics of my own. And it often just will be the case where we'll just kind of be sitting and coming up with the melody, and then words just start coming. And it's not a conscious thing necessarily. And, the words start coming, and then around that, we can build the rest of the lyrical content. When it comes to me just wanting to, like, sing a song or something like that, it relates a lot to my mood. Like, first of all, the happier I am, the more that I want to sing. I don't enjoy singing if I'm, like, just feeling miserable. But I mean, at the risk of embarrassing myself, despite not having been trained in the Broadway stuff, I do really like Broadway musicals, and Disney as well. I have a whole repertoire in my head of Broadway show tunes, and I have a song for every occasion. So whatever's happening in my life, I've got, like, this mishmash of show tunes playing in my head, like the soundtrack to whatever's happening in my life. Um, I don't know. The world would probably be a better place if people would just randomly burst out in choreographed song and dance. Right.
I do feel that. I will admit, occasionally I do sing Cole Porter, so it's not, even I am not exempt from the temptation. I try to stay away from it. Okay, so now going back into astrology a little bit more, I'm just curious how you got interested in that. That's not as exceptional. There are not very many Evola girls, but there are a lot of astrology girls. So how
Yeah,
did
but they're
you?
the wrong kind of astrology. So
Okay,
we do have to make that distinction between modern astrology and Hellenistic astrology, because modern astrology is fake and Hellenistic astrology is the real deal. Um, I was always interested in it from a young age. Now, it's only been like fairly recently that Hellenistic astrology has seen a resurgence, because there's been an increase in the translation of these texts. There's been better translations made available, whereas the modern astrologers, they didn't have those available. And so they were basically just guessing at a lot of things. They were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had. It was very, very contaminated by theosophists, unfortunately, who would just like the idea that Uranus rules Aquarius was literally just Alan Leo saying, I feel like Uranus should rule Aquarius. Okay, buddy. Well, I guess that makes it true. Um, so when I was first looking into this, like as a teenager and stuff, I was just kind of, I had the interest that all girls have, in the sense that women are very interested in the idea of fate, right? And so as a teenage girl, of course, that appealed to me. And I didn't understand it beyond the concept of like, oh, who's my compatible soulmate? What's my horoscope for tomorrow? Which is very, very shallow. And because that wasn't fulfilling, I kind of moved on from that as I got older. And then I came back to it as I started doing the Evola series, because there is so much astrological symbolism embedded everywhere you look within esoteric realms. And I was like, okay, so I have to understand this better. I'm never really going to understand the symbolism here that they're referring to. I need to get a deeper handle on this. And so I started studying Hellenistic astrology, and I was very glad that I did. I didn't initially intend to ever like practice it professionally. I just wanted to understand like, what is the philosophy that underpins these ideas. And I came to find this very beautiful, complex system that, I mean, it would be far outside the scope of this discussion to get into it, but it just neatly explains a lot of different things, like, the polarity of the genders, for example, just things of that nature. And it's this symbolic language, and it's all based on these patterns, right? These cyclical patterns and how they interact with each other. Um, so that was kind of how I got interested in it. It was just, I felt it necessary to approach it, because I wanted to learn more about the esoteric stuff, and I felt like I couldn't go further with it unless I knew this.
okay. So what sorts of sources were you looking to learn about Hellenistic astrology?
I've taken some classes, and I've read some books. I try to get a hold of the original ancient text when I can find a good complete translation online, which is a little bit hard to do. I need to just bite the bullet and order like a big library of like proper actual books, which is pricey. So yeah, I've taken courses, I've read a lot of books, I've put it into practice myself, which frankly was the best thing to do to learn it, actually. I felt like I became a much better astrologer once I actually just like decided to buckle down and just start reading charts for people. So I was like, it's all this theoretical knowledge, but I was having trouble concretizing it into something meaningful. And then it was once I started actually like sitting down and talking to people about their lives and looking at their charts. And then I was kind of like, oh, okay, now I'm getting a better handle on like, what Jupiter and Virgo means, right? Um, so that's become a very big part of what I do these days. And yeah, I haven't gotten sick of it yet. So we'll see how long it holds my attention for. I may move on to alchemy next or something like that.
I expect you will, yeah.
I would like to. I would really like to. And it was kind of like the reason I picked astrology, because it's like, well, I also have to learn like alchemy and theurgy, but astrology is the most accessible of the three.
Hmm.
and it's more foundational.
Yeah, as I've gotten more into Neoplatonism, my interest has increased in astrology. I did look into it earlier on in life, and I've read a few charts in my day. But yeah, it's in Neoplatonism, the cosmology, obviously derived from Plato, just the conventional kind of heliocentric cosmology, has resonances with particular materials and occasions, and so they connect the way in which like the gods participate in certain places, let's say, and particular materials that exhibit the properties of certain gods. And so this basically it lines up like this kind of mechanism where on a certain day you ought to like go visit a particular site with a particular kind of charm made out of a certain material, and it's really the basis of all of that classical magic and the basis of Renaissance magic as well. So you really can't understand Western esoterica unless you understand astrology. So my reading group, my kind of math-oriented, logic-oriented Greek reading group is going to be doing the Tetrabiblios, which is Ptolemy's astrological treatise.
Awesome. I heard
Before
that
too
you
long.
had those groups, but it was like months after the fact, and I was like, darn, I wish I could have gotten in on that.
Well, we're doing Aristotle starting actually tomorrow. So we've gone through like some math textbooks, Greek, ancient Greek math textbooks, Proclus on Euclid, Iamblichus on mathematics in general, and now we're going into the Organon. So that'll be like the categories, prior analytics, and all of that stuff. Um, so
That
have
sounds really
you
cool.
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And if anyone's interested in getting involved, you can do that through the Patreon, or you can contact me on Skype. I make exceptions for a lot of people because I understand not everybody can afford it. So, since I shilled my stuff, why don't you go ahead and explain what you're doing currently that's on offer, courses, classes, what do you have going on?
Um, well, I have my astrology website, astrologicat.com. You can book a reading there if you like. I also try, like, I want to keep this knowledge accessible to people, and one of my biggest gripes with the Hellenistic astrology community is that everybody wants to put everything behind some kind of a paywall where they're charging over $1,000 for their courses, or they're writing books that are just really expensive, and you can't just almost go online and just start learning it for free and get really good quality instruction, or have a place to ask your questions or to practice and get feedback. So one of the things that I've set up, which is just kind of getting started now, we've met a few times, is a twice monthly study group, which is just like $5 to cover the cost of running it. And I've got Hyrith co-hosting that group with me. She's very into astrology as well. And it's basically a place for anybody, whatever your skill level is. If you want to learn about Hellenistic astrology, just come to one of the study groups. We usually have like a theme topic, like last time we were talking about combustions and cazemis. And so every chart we went over, we were just looking at like, what does it mean that a planet is combust in this chart? We'll have a few example charts, explain the concepts, and then people can bring their own charts, or someone else's chart they're working with if they have permission, and be like, all right, well, there's a combustion in this chart. How do I interpret that? And so kind of just like drilling down on like one specific concept and how to delineate that in a chart. And then people can be there to kind of ask questions about their own chart, or people can say, oh, well, how is this played out in your life? Like, can you give us some background information on what this looks like practically in day-to-day life? And so there's a nice kind of feedback going on there. Most of the people who come are total newbies. So we try to keep it like, I'm not going into advanced stuff at this point. I'm not going into any kind of like timing techniques or anything. It's just, for now, just strictly learning how to delineate stuff in a birth chart. Because that's very foundational to anything else. But we run that on Fridays. I do like one Friday I'll do an earlier time so the Europeans can join in. The next Friday I'll do a later time so that the Australians can join in. We kind of try to bounce back and forth like that so everybody gets a chance. But I just wanted to be able to make sure that, people had at least some way of studying this if they want to, but they don't have the time or the money to take these intensive year-long courses.
Hmm. Well, that's great. Yeah. So your website, Once again, what is it called? Okay.
Astrologicat.com.
Okay.
Gotta stick with the cat branding here.
Have you had the same cat since you started the channel? Or?
I have, yes. Yes, he's my mascot. In my earliest videos that are no longer up, he made a lot more appearances. But because he was young then and he just never slept. And now that he's older, he tends to sleep through these. He's actually just sleeping right here next to the window with me. But yeah, we don't see him quite as much these days, but he's still around.
Okay. So we kind of got into this just asking about how you fell into your beliefs, how you developed them, what you're doing with this knowledge now. And that all kind of ignores the prior question of like, why are you the kind of person that went down this path? In Plato, there's the idea of different types of soul, from the Phaedrus. If you have seen the intelligible realm on the other side more, then you might incarnate as a musician, philosopher, or something like that. Or if you're a little bit more down to earth, you might be statesman type, politician. There are these different roles, not just occupations you might take up, but there's something essential in the nature of the soul that fits you to that calling. And, there are similar ideas in Hinduism as well, like someone's caste by birth confines them to certain kinds of occupations. Have you thought very much about what kind of soul you have and, why you feel drawn into this kind of path?
I have thought about that and why other people are not drawn to these things as well. I have a couple of ideas. I'm not sure if they're going to end up conflicting with each other. I have to say, typically when people ask me to come on their shows, they do not ask me questions like what you're asking. So I do apologize to you and anyone in the audience if it seems like I'm not putting my ideas together well. I very rarely actually get a chance to speak out loud about this with another person and have these kind of questions put to me. So I really appreciate that you're giving me these tough questions and letting me think about it like this. So, I have not read that book that you mentioned since, I don't know, like 20 years ago. So I don't remember it very well, but my recollection is that Plato divides like the nature of the soul into the three parts: reason and spirit and appetite, right? Which is very similar to the idea of the three gunas in Vedic thinking, sattva, rajas, and tamas. And I believe Plato also thought that those corresponded to, different castes, much in the way that the Vedic gunas correspond to caste. There's part of me that feels very sattvic in some ways, and there's another part of me that's very rajasic, and I feel like I'm like kind of stuck on the cusp between castes. Like I used to be very politically active, and I'm just bored of it. I'm just like, it's just not something I want to do anymore. So maybe I'm moving more towards a sattvic state, but, I've kind of thought that, and I don't know how this will fit into Platonism, and you can maybe enlighten me on that. I've kind of thought that not everybody actually has an individual soul. That, I kind of lean towards Evelyn's view that what most people think of as the soul is really just like this animating force from the totem or the biospirit or whatever you want to call it, this like daemon or double. It's a bit impersonal, right? It's this emanation from the totem. It's manifesting an individual who then, if they make nothing of their life, they just are reabsorbed back into the totem essentially. And many people of a stock can share in that biospirit without necessarily having their own individual soul. These are the soulless masses, the NPCs, the sheep, the people who don't seem to have any impulse towards anything higher than their own immediate gratifications. But I do think some people must be developing an individual soul. The people who are critical thinkers, who go against the grain, or who have like a really strong holy longing of some kind. The people who somehow differentiate themselves from the mass man. And, I'm not. There are there are probably more things I feel uncertain about in regards to the soul than I feel certain of, but that's kind of what I've been moving towards, and just kind of based on reading and observation and intuition. I mean, what does Plato have to say about that? How far off track do you think I am?
Well, it's interesting. Evola inverts a few things compared to most traditionalist authors, like the relative position of the Rajasic and Sattvic. He has this ideal of kind of a warrior-led society.
Right.
Does he say that specific to Europe? Okay.
Well, what he says is that because in the newly published Intro to Magic Volume 3, he actually has an essay in there that's a direct rebuttal to Guénon, and basically saying, like, not disagreeing with Guénon on a lot of things, but he's differentiating contemplation and action when in fact on the higher plane they are non-different. And I think Evola makes a reasonably good case for his position. Now, obviously, for the next episode, because that's what this whole next episode is going to be about, should be out within probably the next month or so, I have to steelman Evola's position because I'm trying to represent his thought as accurately as I can. And I really struggled with writing that episode because I was having an issue with that, feeling like I feel like Guénon is probably more correct here. But upon further reading, and especially after getting Volume 3 and reading that essay, I find myself more convinced of Evola's position. And what he's saying is that there is not a consistent example of the priests being elevated above the warriors all across traditional societies, that sometimes it's the warriors, or sometimes they don't even have two separate castes. So I won't go into it too much because I don't want to spoil the episode for people, but I don't think he's necessarily wrong in what he's saying, but possibly just has been misunderstood.
That may be. I had this conception that he wanted to elevate the warrior caste in general.
Well, we have to make a distinction between the warrior caste and the sacred king. Because one of the mistakes he's making, and I don't know if this is an issue with the translation or he's just explaining it badly, but in some places he's using the warrior interchangeably with the king, when he's actually specifically talking about a king who has been elevated to that position from the warrior caste. And then the sacred king is, of course, above and beyond caste. And so that distinction no longer applies to him. He's uniting both principles within himself. And so I wonder if some of the confusion has come from this tendency to perhaps use the wrong term to describe what he's intending. I mean, I worked on this episode for like 6 months straight. Like, well, maybe not straight. It was a bit on and off because I had like a move in the middle of all that and everything. But, I kept coming back to it and picking it up and starting again. And I wrote so many drafts and I was just like not happy with any of them. And I feel like I finally got to a place where I could explain it well and that I felt like I understood what he was getting at. And once I got to that point, I was kind of like, I think he might actually be right here.
Well, we'll have to check out that episode, I think, for the full story here. Back to how that lines up with the Platonic account. You describe kind of a sub-individual, totemic, folk spirit that incarnates in, I don't know if it's the majority of people, but many people who are not individually differentiated, and then some kind of set themselves apart with their differentiated aspect. In Platonism, it's kind of the reverse, in the sense that what is essential to the individual is the rational soul, and that cannot be stripped away because it's inherent in the nature of man. Man is the rational animal. So everyone has that kind of higher part of the soul, but actually the good thing to do is to eliminate the individual soul being that kind of, and I don't want to say eliminate, just absorb and integrate the lower individual aspect of the soul so that it's less individual and more in accordance with the universal archetypes. So that inferior portion is what is individual, and that's what's lost. That's what is temporary, and it's not necessarily a good thing to be more individual. Particulars are bad, universals are good in Platonism. That's the long and short of it. So I don't know exactly how that lines up, and I would actually like to hear more about your thoughts on this collective aspect of the soul that you're referring to that seems to be sub-rational. What exactly is that, I guess? Is it like a form of a people in general that instantiates in individual men and women? And then above that, this individual soul that we bring about, it's an interesting concept. Is it tied to the ego? Also, how much have you had in the way of experience with psychology, like Jung or any of that analytical psych? Some? Okay. So are we talking about like an ego complex? Is that individual soul? Does it have like metaphysical self-subsistence? Because I know Evola might be sympathetic with that kind of idea, which is very Indo-European, that some men kind of set themselves apart and gain immortality by virtue of this individuality that they take on. So I can see resonances in what you're saying. I don't know how to line it up with Platonism, but yeah, could you expand on some of those concepts a little bit more?
Okay, so I mean, we might have to kind of touch on a little bit, like, first of all, what happens to the soul, right? After the body, after it no longer has a body, after you die, right? And I feel like this, because, if we're looking at things from a cyclical nature here of a cycle of death and rebirth, reincarnation, this is an essential part of the process. So we almost have to start at death before we go to the rebirth and the whole lifespan of the soul, essentially. So my thoughts are that intent and will play a very strong part in the fate of the soul in the afterlife. And the soul, most importantly, is only developing a good intent and a will to goodness if it has successfully liberated itself from any accrual of spiritual ignorance that it has gathered onto itself throughout its life. So in the afterlife, the soul is then immediately directed towards the goodness that it desires. And then, daemons, if I assume you're familiar with the concept of daemons, probably most of your audience is, these daemons of the descending kind that want to tempt you back into materiality, they play a role in this, directing souls back into the cycle by appealing to the desires of these souls that have died. So for the majority of people who lived in a state of total spiritual ignorance, but they haven't really done anything particularly good or bad, it's very easy for the daemons to win their interest because they're so ignorant to the cycle of reincarnation in the spiritual realm. So they're just very easily shuttled by the daemons into their next lives, and they're being enticed with the goods of that. Like maybe you died with a strong craving towards, you wanted to be an astronomer and you never got to be, right? And so the daemons coming and saying, well, in your next life, you could have a chance at that, right? So by this enticement, the souls forget their prior lives because their strong intent is for this new life and the goods that it will deliver them. It takes over the faculties of the soul and essentially, kind of wipes the memories of their previous life, because it's needless, and the soul always sheds everything that's needless in the afterlife. So, well, what does this actually mean in terms of its relation to this being an emanation from the totem? What are these daemons? Well, in Doctrine of Awakening, Evola says these daemons are entities of craving. And in Buddhism, these are called sankharas. And Buddhism says that it's not aspects of the individual personality per se that survive the death of the individual, but just these sankharas, these cravings and aversions, that this is the only thing that survives the death of the body. So these daemons are like the life force of a sankhara. If you die with a tremendous craving for something, then that's the only part of you that gets to live again. Nothing else of your individual egoic personality gets to go along with it. You wanted to be an astronomer, it's simply that craving to be an astronomer that lives again. Nothing else about you personally in this life will live on, is what, the Buddha says. Now, one of my disagreements with Buddhism is it's starting to kind of, to me, I've always kind of felt like Buddhism leaves out the possibility of the heroic soul that can kind of make that Olympian leap and rejoin with God. And I think this is one of the reasons that Western Buddhism often tends towards basically a form of atheism, which I don't think was the original intent of Buddhism. But, Buddhism being a pathway to achieve liberation from conditioned existence means, and the Buddha even said, even Brahma is conditioned, and he wanted to go beyond that. He wants to go to that unconditioned Godhead. Well, in that sense, when you get there, do you still really have a soul? I don't know. These are all kind of questions that percolate in my mind. But, I do think that, the majority of people really are nothing but this collection of sankharas. And as new manifestations arise from this, this biospirit of the stock, these cravings are just essentially going back into this pool, being reshuffled and then remanifested again, over and over. Now, maybe it's possible that sometimes you get a daemon who tries to entice you with a spiritual longing. Maybe there's a daemon that wants to be free of this totem, and it's going to use you as the tool to do that, and says, hey, go back to this life, and maybe you'll get to achieve spiritual liberation this time. And if that's what your mind was oriented toward, that's the goodness that you were trying to achieve, well, then maybe you get a daemon that is, less attached to the totem in some way. What do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting. Daimons have a similar role in Neoplatonism when they are of that descending type. But that, of course, is the aberration. Daimons essentially are of a higher order than human souls. And each of us has our kind of presiding daimon that is more rational than ourselves. In one sense, Socrates' daimon could be said to be a supernatural entity that's attached to him that gives him advice. In another sense, it could be said to be kind of the core of his intellect, because ultimately, like in Neoplatonism, one thing contains and reflects everything else. And so to say that two things are in contact is to say that there's a kind of mutual containment between those things. So the distinction between Socrates' individual soul and his daimon is not absolute in Platonism. And I do think that all of us do have that daimonical aspect that is higher than our rational faculties. Many of us experience that in intuitive leaps, in reasoning, or like a sense that something is like true in a way that can't be grounded in conventional human wisdom. So I think that providence would necessitate that. If the first principle of all things is essentially good, then it's going to tend after its creatures in one form or another. I think what you're saying is correct to a degree, that, most people are predominantly influenced by those irrational drives, and those drives will be shaped by nefarious daimons. I actually believe that as well. But I think there is an essential nature to the rational soul in each of us, which is eternal. And there's also that daimonical, super-rational element of each of us that is given to us by divine providence and will attend to our spiritual development in one form or another. So I get what you're saying about like the NPC, the kind of general mass.
What is Platonism's answer then to why some people are, more prone to wanting to pursue these kind of things and the mass man isn't?
Fate, which is essentially the law of karma, right? Because of actions that we take. Because we do have free will to a degree in each particular decision, and we can attend to that daimonical inspired side of ourselves, or the rational, or we can attend to desires in lower daimonical spirits. And that movement of our attention is our fundamental choice, I think. So, now that would get into like the problem of evil. Why does God establish a way of things, a law of fate that operates in this way? And it must be for the best, ultimately, because creatures themselves have to have freedom and be prolific themselves and create themselves to have the best of all possible worlds. If you had creatures that were inert and that was just the end of it, God created a bunch of robots, it wouldn't be so interesting. The other side is that, for God, all of the goodnesses that are contained even in those appetitive, involved earthly things that we undergo, the goodnesses in those experiences, having a slice of pumpkin pie or whatever, the goodness in that goes back to God and is received by God in our reversion. And if the procession and all of the sin didn't happen, then in a way, God wouldn't experience the best of all possible worlds, the most possible goodness. So that's Proclus's solution to the problem of evil. I think it's actually probably the best in the philosophical literature. But I still want to ask about this question because it's an important topic in Platonism, the different levels of the soul, what is essential to human nature, what is immortal, what is not immortal. And so that leads to this question of in this hierarchy of entities, are we any one of them? Do you believe there is a kind of kernel of the self that is that which transmigrates? In one sense, you seem to talk about it for most people it's this assemblage of forces that kind of meets in a body and then gets attached in new ways and kind of reconfigures and reincarnates in that way. But there must be some kind of unity underlying that process, the self itself. What is that kind of thing that keeps it all together? Do you think there has to be such a thing?
I don't know if there has to be such a thing. That's probably something that I would need to think about a little bit more. I'm very open-minded about this. I'm not, I'm not married to any of these ideas, and I'm certainly open to having my mind changed on these things. There's always, going to be more to learn than what I already know. And I find, learning one thing just tends to produce 10 more questions, but I kind of think that, there's kind of two pathways for you. You can either stay stuck in the cycle of death and rebirth, in which case your individual self is getting dissolved back into the totem, and that's it for you. And you just are constantly just being reshuffled and redealt. Or you make your way, all the way as the Buddha tried to do, to reunite with the unconditioned Godhead, which again results in the loss of any individuality. So, yeah, I'm not sure. I'd have to give that some thought.
Yeah, well, that is the oracle at Delphi, the inscription, the famous one, "Know thyself," that in a way motivated Greek philosophy as a whole. And I think it's kind of the ultimate question, what are we? What is the nature of the soul? Or are we even the soul? That's something that I found reading Proclus, for example. The way he talks about the soul makes it seem as though each soul, being eternal, is kind of condemned to an eternal cycling, down into matter, back to the forms. But that is only bad, I guess, if we are essentially the soul. And that then, kind of ties into this Hindu idea that Atman, the core of our identity, is Brahman, that ultimate metaphysical principle. That's pretty clear from the Upanishads. I don't know how much Hare Krishnas emphasize it, but that's kind of the leading question from the last question I asked. That's where I was aiming at here. What do you think about that idea, Atman as Brahman? And that, because for me, that was the core of my, I don't want to use corny language to express it, but kind of spiritual awakening. When I saw things in a different way, it was when I saw that, what I see around me is not fundamentally distinct from myself. What is the deepest in me is also what's the deepest in nature and in the other people around me. So that, it opens for compassion. I think it's a very important idea, but it can also be taken very bad directions and used as an excuse for pure hedonism and selfishness and things like that. So what is your idea then, or your thought on Atman as Brahman?
I think if we're going to talk about that, we have to be very careful with the way we are phrasing it, because to say Atman is Brahman often results in this new agey idea that we're all God. I'm God, you're God, we're all just God, and we're not God. We might have a speck of God in us, a connection to God, but it's the same thing as taking a bucket of water from the ocean and then declaring that bucket of water to be the ocean, rather than to have been from the ocean or part of the ocean. Now you can pour it back into the ocean and it becomes the ocean again, but while it's in that bucket and it's its own individual entity, it is not the ocean. So for that reason, I can't say, I don't like to say the Atman is Brahman, because it does tend to lead people to thinking that they are God rather than that they have come from God or are a part of God. But, you know, it's no different than if I said, you know, like, well, my hair is me. If I cut off my hair, I'm still me. It's just part of me, right? So we have to distinguish between what is, you know, kind of this original source that is God, and then the things that come from it that are manifestations, but not the same as God. You know, I don't have the powers of God, so how can I claim that I'm God?
So this opens up a further question then about the nature of that distinction between, let's just say, like creatures and creator. We'll call Brahman creator here. If we're creatures distinct in some way, what is it that we contain that's outside of God? Or like, how are we distinct? What is the nature of that distinction? I'm in Keith Wood's reading group on Eric Pearl's book, Thinking Being, and really good book, by the way. He talks about this question in light of the Neoplatonic doctrine of matter as an individuating principle. So I don't know, how you make sense of it or what exactly the creator-creature distinction amounts to for you. I have that Neoplatonic background and way of thinking and my own, ways of trying to get around this question. It's a deep question, but if you can share your thoughts on it. What are we different from God?
Well, I guess that is going to depend a lot on how we define God. If we're defining God as being like this unconditioned source, then we're different because we're conditioned and we're material. But if we're talking about, a personified God, an anthropomorphized God, maybe starting to get a little bit more into gray territory there. I tend to think of God as just being this unconditioned source, because anything else that is a manifestation of God, even if it's God personified, is still in some ways being differentiated from the unconditioned.
Right. Have you thought about the problem that something that is unconditioned in light of a conditioned, unconditioned categorical division is subordinate to that categorical division? That like even calling the absolute unconditioned can't, in a direct kind of positive predication sense, be true in an unqualified way of him.
Why can it not be true?
Oh, just because if he is unconditioned rather than conditioned, that positive act of predication or cataphatic predication of God subordinates his nature or essence to the categorical scheme in question. That's why like in the Parmenides, the one can't be the same as anything or different than anything.
Right.
But
I mean, it's a valid point, I suppose. I don't have anything really to push back on that with. So I could accept that, I guess.
I find that a lot of people I've been talking to are becoming more interested in theology. And I've had this hunch that like the problems that were being discussed in the medieval period between the scholastics were never fully resolved. We just thought we could get over it with like the modern Cartesian reset in philosophy. And before too long, we're going to have like Scotists and, like Origenists and Thomists running around, YouTube making their positions. So,
May be the case. Maybe that's part of that broader path of society as they try to find their way back to spirituality.
yeah. I mean, it would be appropriate kind of going back to the beginning of our actual civilization, which did begin in the medieval period, if you want to believe like Spengler's scheme, broadly speaking. Okay, well, this has been really fun. We could hit a couple other topics or maybe look at chat. Does anyone in chat have questions? If you've already asked them, I'm not going to be able to find them, so go ahead and ask them now before we wrap up here. I did see one earlier. Someone asks, "What is your favorite metal band?"
Probably Agalloch would be up there. Although my favorite album is Cyrenia's first album. But as a like taking their whole body of work, it would probably be Agalloch.
Okay, I'm not a metal fan myself.
Well, you are missing out.
I just can't. I can't listen to the scream singing. It like hurts my throat sympathetically. Is that the kind of vocals that you would do for
Me? No, I would.
Okay.
I would not be here to tell the story if I did that and my teacher had found out about it. So no, I always, because when I was getting into it, it was very trendy at the time for like symphonic metal with female fronted lead singer. And so that's kind of how I ended up doing that because I liked the genre, but at the same time, like because of bands like After Forever and Nightwish and Epica, like everybody was like, oh, we want to have like an operatic female singer. And so that was just like the thing for a while. So I didn't have to misuse my voice, fortunately.
Okay. Yeah. Not aware of the different subgenres in metal and all of that. Okay, well, why don't we close? I'm not seeing too many other questions in the chat. And if you do ask questions, just put like at Airvol and I should be able to see them. Here's a question. So you once said you were a Roman Catholic once. Do you sometimes still attend High Mass? Do you ever go to Mass?
I do not go to Mass. I have been to a few like Orthodox services in the last few years just because I had a number of friends who converted to Orthodoxy and, they always want to bring you along or you get invited to their baptisms and things like that. So, I'll always go to anything like that if it's supporting somebody else's spiritual journey. Like, you want me at your baptism? I will be there. But I don't go of my own accord, and I haven't been to a Catholic Mass in a very long time. Probably the last one I would have gone to was when one of my grandparents died. So just basically for a funeral, which isn't really the same thing. I couldn't see myself going. I don't know. Maybe somebody could talk me into going to like a Latin Mass with all the just the nice ceremony and all the beautiful stuff that it should have. But if I have to go sit in a sterile warehouse type church and listen to really bad pop music, no thank you.
I actually play music at the modern masses, but usually I don't pick like the most egregious stuff that they offer.
You get to pick it yourself?
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, I think we actually addressed this question. What do you and Kat think is the highest virtue? We actually both picked truth. As far as like the cardinal virtues, like wisdom, courage, temperance, prudence, because truth is kind of like what we're aiming at and isn't something, I guess you could say you possess truth yourself in a way, but a virtue is more like an aptitude or an ability that you possess, at least for the Greeks. So among those, like wisdom, courage, temperance, prudence, what do you see as like most important to you, basically?
I feel like the answer to that almost depends on your caste, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where like wisdom is going to be a lot more important to somebody of the priestly caste and courage more important to somebody in the warrior caste, right? But to some extent, you have to have them all. Just to what degree it's required to have them is maybe what's in question. I think these days I probably tend to value wisdom the most.
Yeah. Your intuitions are very good because that's exactly Platonic dogma on that.
I feel like the other ones kind of lead to that in a way.
And depend on it. There is the mutual interpenetration of the virtues, and they are all kind of suspended from wisdom as the master virtue.
Yeah, you're much better at explaining those kind of things than I am, because you're, I think, far more erudite in terms of, especially like your book learning. Um, I'm a very scatterbrained person, and I'm like, people ask me a question, I'm sitting here just giving them like this long stream of consciousness, and then I'm like, wait, what was the question you asked me? Did I even answer it?
I don't mean this in
I
a
know the limits of my
misogynistic way at all, but you are a woman, and we kind of expect that. And it's what you offer that's different from, all of the nerds that I talk to.
I'll have to strive to get a better reincarnation.
Oh yeah, that is also true in Platonism. If you're incarnate as woman, it means you've kind of declined to that position. I don't know if I fully agree. But
I've been wondering a lot about that, because in the Kali Yuga, all the rules are a little bit different and all bets are off. And I've been putting some thoughts together on that are probably completely heretical to tradition, and I'm reluctant to even speak about them because I don't want to lead somebody down the wrong path just because I have a stupid idea about women and what we should be doing. So for now, I'm kind of keeping it to myself, but I do wonder if maybe there's a way in which the inversion of everything in the Kali Yuga might also apply to that.
In a normative sense?
Well, in terms of, women being less capable or incapable of achieving any kind of spiritual transcendence, or needing to rely on a man to provide that kind of solar pathway for her, as Evola says is the case. Always it has been that, man is more representative of spirit, right? And that which is transcendent. But in the Kali Yuga, we're even seeing the inversion of genders and sexes, and what does that mean for these kind of traditional viewpoints on these things? Is it still the case? It's something I've been thinking about for maybe the last year and a bit, because I get so many questions from women about this, and I have yet to come to an answer that I feel satisfied with. And so I don't want to put my whole theories out there without feeling like I'm sure of it, because I feel like if you're going to speak about topics like this, you do have a big responsibility to your audience, not to just say whatever comes to mind without considering the karmic consequences it could have on somebody else. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you're putting an idea out there that somebody might incorporate into their spiritual worldview or practice, and it's wrong, and you lead them down a wrong path, in some way that's going to come back onto you.
Risking all of that, though, I would say that in light of that inversion that we're living through, since most of us are more feminine than humanity has generally been in other ages, like men are feminized today, because of that, it's, you have to apply the medicine that actually suits the condition of the patient. And if we're in a feminine psychological state as mass society, then it's almost as if, the archetypal feminine, the accomplished, or, a culminated feminine maybe, has the lessons to draw us out of that position that we're in, perhaps.
Yes.
But
and tradition doesn't say much about this. It doesn't say really much about what that would look like or how to practically apply it. And, that's kind of the difficulty that I come up against, because there's just not, maybe there is some, and if somebody knows of something, please send it to me. I'd love to read it, but I have not really come across anything that speaks to what to do in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
And you will have some religious texts that speak about, the end times and the Kali Yuga and what that's going to be like, but not what the pathway is out of it. And I have a hard time believing that even in the darkest of times, there wouldn't still be some door open to find God, no matter how difficult it might be to find or how unorthodox it might be. There will still always be a way. It will never be fully closed off. I just don't, I mean, I guess I don't have I can't point to some text and say like, well, this text said it'll never be fully closed off, but just intuitively, I feel like that would just not be the case. It's not, I don't think it's really possible for that to happen on a metaphysical level. But at the same time, I mean, the traditionalist view is that, you need to have this solar principle to guide you on that. And if men are lacking that, then what do? Do women develop that in themselves? And if they do, how do they do that? Because the pathways for men for heroism are not suited to women. Have a woman follow some kind of ascetic or warrior pathway is it's doing violence to what her own femininity is, and it's going against her nature. So you're trying to then still find a masculine pathway to that. You know what I mean? So maybe there's a feminine path to do that, but what would it be? Because so many of the things that I see women drawn to spiritually are very it's like this out of control Shakti, and it's very dark and destructive. And like all of these new age women in my community, they love going to these like ecstatic full moon dances. And it's like, what are you guys doing? Like, it's so stupid. But it's not even stupid. It's in some ways spiritually dangerous. And I don't think that that's the right pathway either. And yet that's all I see women drawn towards. So it leaves me at a bit of not a crossroads. I mean, it's just an outright roadblock there. So it's something I have to think more about. I'm certainly happy to hear other people's thoughts on it, because I feel like I'm at the point now where I'm sort of going around in circles in my own mind about it.
Yeah. Well, our concept of the archetypes of femininity has been warped partly, I mean, I will admit, as a result of the role of women within Christianity. Abrahamic religions are unusually, I would say, patriarchal compared to even Indo-European religions in general. And if you look at like Greek mythology, there are many facets of archetypal femininity that are expressed in different characters that can tell us something. Like Diana is an important character. Athena is an important character. They are solar women, goddesses.
I have kind of been leaning towards that, right? Like, if Aphrodite and Demeter are what Evola points out as being the women's heroic pathways, but it's dependent on a man, possibly some of these other archetypes might offer some answers. I have been fairly drawn to Athena in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Who, in a manner of speaking, is dependent on Zeus, emerges out of Zeus.
Right.
But
Zeus does not have to be emblematic of a man as such, but simply that solar principle.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the one thing that I do say to women when they're like, well, what do I do if I want to transcend, but I can't find a man to help me on that path? It's like, well, if you can't find a man who's properly embodying that Shiva force, then all that's left is just to submit yourself to Shiva himself. The problem is that nobody knows what that really looks like. There are people, I mean, there are, the Shaivites might have some ideas about that, but all of these practices are largely geared for men to practice them. And that's the problem I keep coming up against, is that it's not designed for the female nature to bring out the best in the female nature, not to bring out that very chthonic, watery, material nature, but to bring out the feminine on that higher plane. And this is a part of what I come up against in my own spiritual seeking, and part of why I don't have a practice that I've settled on, because I feel like they're going against my nature in some way. Not that, and I'm not saying that it's a case of like, well, I just don't want to have to discipline myself to do X, Y, and Z. It's just that, no, these practices are masculine in nature. And they're meant for men, because it was men who did these things for the vast majority of history. It wasn't women, who were taking up these priestly roles by and large.
Yeah, it's a real challenge because
It's a conundrum.
the usual situation is that the husband provides spiritual grounding for the whole family, including the wife. That's true in Abrahamic religions. That's true in ancient Indo-European religions.
It's pretty
And
consistent throughout tradition.
yeah, and so when you're in a situation where men have been feminized and they're not able to take on that role, and women are more educated in general than men today, like women our age are more educated than men our age.
And also sort of seem to have more of a spiritual longing as well.
Yes, I mean, I think there has been a war on masculine nature, especially in the West in general. So it's just tragic because the people who need to rescue men from this position are the men. Like, men have to take care of themselves, but in the meantime,
They
if
can't
women
even find
have
their
this
own solar
agency,
principle.
yeah, and they can't,
They're so
many
feminized
can't.
themselves in many ways. And so
Yes.
they're, functionally on a metaphysical level, they are very much like women themselves. And so they're coming up against the same problem. I would say within my astrology practice, probably the number one question I get from people is they want help figuring out their spiritual purpose or their path or something. From women, I hear complaints that they are the ones who have to shoulder this burden in their family of being the spiritual leader, and they are so frustrated that their husband isn't interested or won't do it or isn't capable of doing it. And they feel like they can't relax into their own femininity as a result. They're basically spiritually having to be the man. From men, who I'm probably an anomaly among astrologers in that most of my clientele is actually men. And they're coming and saying, I want to find my spiritual path, but I don't know how. They're completely lost. They've had no example in their life of what healthy masculinity looks like. They're trying to LARP at it, but not getting very far, feeling very unfulfilled. And they're kind of like they're stumbling through the dark with zero guidance whatsoever. So it is a really big problem, and I don't have a good answer for it at this point.
Yeah. Well, what I was getting at before, I think, is important that if men are feminized, before they can exercise masculine virtue, they first have to actually now learn how to practice feminine virtue, which may seem like a contradiction, but it's better to be like, I don't want to say something like, I'm going to not say what I was about to say, but
whatever you say is not going to offend me. Feel free to speak plainly.
no, it's just, it's better to be a solar femboy than like the maximally degenerate femboy, I guess. Is that where we've come to? I'm not sure, but in any case, like, men have to learn how to embody the aspect of the feminine that is submissive to rational principles, submissive to sources of authority higher than ourselves. Like, part of why men are lost is that it's not just that there aren't any men to look up to, it's that they're unwilling to look up to something superior to themselves. Like, before you can lead, you have to follow. And so men do have to learn how to, like, practice those feminine virtues. Like, that's, I think, in the imagery in Christianity of the church being the body of Christ and the bride of Christ. So, taking on that identity for a time and, like, absorbing the masculine as that more appropriate feminine might be a way to kind of flip to the other side and become masculine yourself. I don't know. There's too many weird transgender implications in that.
If you look at the archetype of the sage, right? The wizard, and this old wise man who has all the answers. In order to get that wisdom, because wisdom does have a sort of like feminine character to it, whereas that intellectual, logical knowing is more the masculine version of that. There's a way in which he has to kind of, to use the Jungian term, integrate his anima.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing, I think, with a lot of young men who are very feminized, they're like anima possessed in a way.
Yes.
And as a result of that, they're struggling to even see their own masculinity, yet they're in denial about this femininity that's like driving the story of their life. And they don't know how to actually, like, because they're like, the anima is part of the shadow, like it's like the opposite gender shadow version, right? If to stay with the Jungian theme. So they're not necessarily consciously aware of it, even though it's blatantly obvious to all of us on the outside who are looking at, you know, whoever our man is that we're using as our case study. And until he's conscious of it and integrates it in a healthy way, then he's not going to benefit from the wisdom that can bring. Instead, you get these men who are like very full of ego, very angry and loud and aggressive. And it's like, that's not actually masculinity. Like what they call toxic masculinity is really just anima possession.
That's a great point. Yeah, so ultimately then I assume you'll be starting some kind of mother goddess cult in South America. We can...
Come drink ayahuasca with me.
Okay.
No, don't do that.
So are you familiar with Argentinian folklore, milonga? That's a question.
Argentinian folklore? Not really, no. I did used to dance Argentinian tango, but it didn't come with any folklore studies.
Okay.
I was trying to develop my root chakra. It didn't work.
Right, Kat was saying before how she doesn't have
I have no
a sense of rhythm. Yeah, unfortunate.
George makes fun of me for this all the time.
And let me see. I kind of lost my place. And there were more questions that were coming in. If you still have time.
We went off onto no, that's fine. We went off on a big digression there. So please.
It's an important issue, really.
It is, and I appreciate actually having that bit of back and forth, because it's that sort of thing that can help you kind of like start to clarify these things in your mind a little bit more, and having somebody to just even soundboard and bounce things back. So I'll probably be pondering over this again for several days afterwards.
Somebody asks, what is truth? I think that will have to wait for another stream. And let's see. There is... Somebody asks if I don't like metal. Do I like synthwave? I'm okay about synthwave. I like Baroque music. I listen to a lot of Bach.
You're a classical musician.
Yeah. And then Brian Nguyen asks about my thoughts on women. And I think we kind of went into that just now. Let's see. Only a couple. Have I read The Secret of the Golden Flower? I'm not sure what that book is.
Me neither.
Nope.
The title sounds vaguely familiar, but I couldn't tell you who wrote it or where I've heard of it.
And have you read any Savitri Devi?
I have.
Apparently that was the original dissident cat lady.
I know, people back when I was still on Twitter, I'm sure they still make fun of me even though I'm gone from Twitter, but people would just make fun of me for being a cat lady. And it's like, hello, Savitri Devi literally wrote a memoir about all the stray cats that she took care of. I have not even remotely approached that level yet. And the thing with cats is, like, they choose you. Don't judge me because I have good cat energy. That's a gift from God, And I do like Savitri Devi in some ways. I read her prison memoir, Defiance, a couple years ago, and I remember really liking it, but thinking that she's really annoying. Like, she's really got like this martyr complex going on. She's a very bright person, but I would imagine like to be around her in person would have been a little bit insufferable.
Okay.
But that said, I don't know. I'm over here channeling the cat lady essence that she had, so I probably shouldn't judge it. Give me 50 years and I'm going to end up just like that.
All right. So, what are the odds of us finding the perennial civilizations that Evola describes in the future? Hyperborea, Atlantis, Lemuria. This is actually the question, sort of, that I originally wanted to end on. A lot of people are black-pilled on the state of things, spiritually, in terms of like what's happening with our culture, politically. Do you see some kind of, and I don't want to take this in a political vein, but do you see a ray of hope? Do you see like, how do we reformulate this? Is your intuition telling you something about the light on the other side of this?
I mean, it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, right? I feel like there is a ray of hope. I just have not identified yet what it is. And I'm a little bit black-pilled in regards to just like the question of like the average person. I think most people are just not going to make it, to use the Zoomer lingo. But I think there will still be people for whom they manage to find a way, whatever that way is. And maybe it's the case that in this darkness, we all have to chart our own unique path, just hacking through the jungle of spirituality with a machete. I don't know. Probably not going to be the most beautiful and graceful path there ever was. But I know Evola's kind of like, well, this is all on a downward slide. We can't stop it at this point. The only thing you can do is remain standing amidst the ruins. I tend to agree with that. I don't have hope for society as a whole. Eventually, this is going to play out. The avalanche is too far down the slope now to stop it. It will wipe out most people. But I do have hope that there are people, and an increasing number of people, who are interested in becoming the kind of people who can remain standing amidst the ruins. And maybe they're not all going to be successful. I don't know. I'll try to do it. I don't know if I'll be successful. Maybe not. Probably not. It'll be hard. But I have hope that there will be some people who can do it, who can still kind of pass that torch on to the next generation that comes after, and to kind of relight the fires of the golden age.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I agree also with Evola on that. We will experience the consequences of our actions collectively, and our civilization is not going to make it. Now, what happened last time our civilization collapsed, like when Roman civilization collapsed, was people set up monasteries, and that classical learning was transmitted in a religious context, in insular communities, that were conservative in nature. And so that's always been kind of where it seems obvious to me the only real hope can lie, is secure, starting with yourself, ground yourself spiritually, your family, community, local communities, and communities of practice, of education, tradition, passing these things on. Unfortunately, the aforementioned feminization of men means like there aren't a lot of people prepared to actually get up and do that. So it's very
well, I have to
disheartening.
say, even though it seems that way, I have to say, in the time that I've been doing my channel, and especially since I started up the astrology practice, I have heard from a lot of lost young men who ended up like just turning their lives around into these success stories. And they were like these, like, the porn addicted incels living in the basement with no job and no hope and no ambition. And they just couldn't even figure out what the first step was to take. And yet they somehow managed something. I don't know, maybe a seed was planted somewhere that suddenly sprouted or something, but just like they would just kind of decide to grab life by the horns, and their condition just suddenly became unacceptable to them, and they really put in the work. And I feel like if some of these guys could do it, then anybody can do it, as long as they have the willpower and the strength and the courage to do that. It's not easy, but some of these people, I would have looked at them initially and thought, there's no hope for them. There's no way they're going to get themselves out of this mess. And, increasingly, I feel like maybe it's these people who really hit rock bottom who are the only ones who have the motivation or something. I don't know. But, yeah, we'll see, I guess.
I guess, yes. Further demonstration also on the efficacy of the mother goddess cult of PhilosophiCat, or PhilosophiCat, sorry about that. So
Get one
we can
mispronunciation for free.
great. So you can sign up for that cult on the website and find her videos on YouTube. The link should be in the description of this video for that. And I'm not anti-cult, let me just say. Like, I think in general there should be more cults in these circles. I think a lot of benefit can come from it.
We need cults, just not cults of personality.
Yeah, cults of the goddesses and gods that we can look to. All right, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Have a good rest of your day. God bless, and best wishes.